Welcome to the Nerd Journey Podcast. Our goal is to help you, the technology professional, accelerate your career progression, increase your job satisfaction, and be more effective in your existing role.
We want to bring listeners like you the career advice we wish we'd been given earlier in our careers.
I'm John White, at VJourneyman on Twitter, sharing co-host duties with Nick Cordy at NetworkNerd_.
We're two former IT operations guys who have moved on to pre-sales roles with technology vendors. We have our opinions, but we also like to highlight the journeys of others and see what we can learn from them.
We'd also like to ask for your feedback to make this a conversation, not a one-way broadcast. Email us at nerdjourneypodcast@gmail.com or DM us at nerdjourney on Twitter. So come join us on our nerd journey.
Let's take a trip. Episode 305. What exactly is a technical alliance? Technology companies create alliance partnerships to support product integration, as one example, and of course, to increase revenue opportunities. But the relationships between companies that form an alliance can get pretty complex. Brad Pinkston knows this all too well, and this week he's back to share the story of moving from a large company to a startup, and at the same time, moving from a people manager back to an individual contributor. In part one of this discussion with Brad, we'll talk about what we mean when we say go-to-market strategy. We'll talk about what it's like to interview for a second-line people manager role. Also, what happens when your new job turns out to be something very different than you expected. And after listening to this episode, you might want to look a little bit differently at startups before joining. Let's get you to part one of our discussion with Brad Pinkston.
Brad Pinkston, welcome back to the Nerd Journey Podcast.
Thanks, guys. It's good to be back on. It's been a while.
Absolutely. I think we last talked to you in 2020, the path to people management. Can you tell us a little bit about what you've done since then?
Well, not only go through a pandemic with you guys, but I decided to do the thing that I think a lot of us in tech think about here or there and wonder if the grass is greener. But I left the big company and attempted life at a startup. From not only big company life to startup life, but went from a people manager role back into a individual contributor. So there have been a few changes since the last time we talked, and that lasted for a while, which we can talk a little bit more about. But then I transitioned out of that back to big company, but still in an individual contributor SE role now.
I want to start with digging into what attracted you to startup life in the first place. What makes that alluring from someone who is working for a big company XYZ?
I would say there's two things, Nick. I mean, I think any of us that are, on the sales side are probably not being honest if we don't at least acknowledge the fact that part of it was, hey, there could be a huge stock payday, right? I mean, that would be awesome. I mean, fundamentally, what I really like to do is I like to build things from the ground up, right? And I kind of saw that big company, in a first-line management role, I didn't feel like at times, and in hindsight's 2020, so I'm not sure that I would say the same now, but I didn't feel like I had as much control over my own destiny. I wasn't the architect of what I was building, you know what I mean, at the big company. And so that's what I thought that I was going to go do. Startup life was going to be, let's build an organization, let's build a relationship. My role with the startup that I went to was going to be to lead the relationship between my past company and the new company, because the new company was supposed to be a big part of like an OEM type of technology with the company that I was leaving. And, my role was supposed to be to come in and develop sales strategy and, work between the two and, teach the salespeople at the company that I was going to work for how to work with the sellers at the old company. and then teach the sellers at the old company what this, new technology was, because it was completely different segment, much more security focused, and some networking around it as well. And it was something that was just kind of out of the area of expertise of the old company. I thought that I was going to get to build something there, is kind of what attracted me to answer your question, Nick.
And building can take a lot of different forms. We've talked to people who like to build infrastructure. So you were a people manager, you've built teams, you've led teams, and so now you're building this organization, and I guess you would say the structure, processes, and the way of working together as an organization for the startup. I think that we would probably classify that as a little bit of an adjacency, because you would have past knowledge of the company you left, and its solution is going to be tightly integrated in some way with the company you're going to, so you're not going in with a complete lack of knowledge on the entire product set. I think that's pretty good, relatable experience from what I'm hearing.
Yeah, I think you are hitting the nail on the head. Like, anytime I transition between roles, I'm always up for a new challenge, and that's why any of us take on new roles, but I try to make sure that there's a cornerstone of my skill set that's going to be translatable. And, my thought process was that I understood the tech, that was part of the cornerstone, and I understood the relationships and go-to-market and, the way that this was going to work. And I will say that I was 1 for 2 on on the two things that I thought were going to be the cornerstones there. I did understand the tech really well, but the way that the relationships were going to work and what my role was really going to be, I was completely wrong about.
Oh, I'd love to dive into that, but could you clarify a term that you've used a couple times now? I think I know what you mean when you say go to market, but I'm not sure that everybody does. It's kind of an overloaded term, right?
And that is a fantastic transition to all kinds of different things that are in my mind, because I think that part of what I learned, John, is the fact that go-to-market means a lot of different things in a lot of different places. To me, what go-to-market was going to be to interface with the sales teams, create sales strategy, actually be the forefront of the people in sales that were going to go to market and talk to customers. I didn't expect to be riding alongside people at the new company and the old company and be in every meeting, nothing like that. But I did think that it would be on the forefront of selling, and boy, was I wrong.
So more of a behind-the-scenes kind of thing is where you found yourself. Is that accurate, or?
Yeah, wrong how?
What I actually ended up getting was kind of what I felt I was in before. Instead of developing go-to-market and being in charge of this is the strategy, I was in a place where I was much more, oh, no, you have no opinion on what should happen. You're just going to do what we tell you to do. So I was part of their idea of go-to-market, but their idea of go-to-market was really just to,
execute the go-to-market plan?
Yeah.
Not craft it.
Exactly. Don't craft it. And the other thing that was very surprising and telling to me, which is, kind of the difference in big company and startup world, you would think that there would be a lot more collaboration in startup land. I had, direct access to, a lot of the executives and things like that, but very little input. Even great conversations around what I thought in the beginning, but it was one of those situations where, well, thanks for telling us what you think, and thanks for bringing all the experience, but we're going to do something completely different. So I didn't have the input into the development of the go-to-market the way that I thought I would around, this is who we should sell to, this is the value proposition, this is who we should actually spend our time with. And I think that there was just a lot of misunderstandings between the two companies. And I spent a lot of time trying to correct them, and it didn't end up being fruitful.
What I heard was you weren't able to make the impact that you wanted to.
Bingo. When you're kind of a builder engineer mindset, like I think we all are, you want to see that impact. Whether it's a check or a big deal or happy customers or, you just feel like a sense of success, you got to have some kind of payoff of impact. And I didn't feel like I had any at the end of the day.
Payoff of impact, but also like ability to be creative in solutioning, because you lost that too.
Yeah, exactly. That's one of my big lessons learned on startup life is, you hear startup, I would just say all the things that you think, flat org structure, a lot of collaboration, jack of all trades, all these different things. Not all startups are created equal. And the thing that I learned, which was interesting, which I never heard a lot of startup people talk about, you hear the hard work, everybody, just pitching in kind of stuff. You don't hear about the different levels of or inflection points of startups and everything that goes through there. Well, I joined this company at an inflection point, which was very detrimental timing-wise to when I joined. And I see the looks on your faces, so I will elaborate on that, but I'll pause for any questions first.
I say keep going, unless John has a question.
I would love for you to continue along that thought path.
It makes sense now that I know, but in any organization, as it grows and changes, you've got to go from a small organization where everybody pitches in and it doesn't matter. I'll clean the toilets if I need to. I'll be a janitor. I'll do any process that is needed for me to do as long as it helps, the company or the team achieve their goal. Well, at some point as a good leader, you've got to recognize this is just chaos and it's inefficient. And you've got to transition into this is your role, this is your role, this is your role. And that's where the inflection point of this startup was. And it was a good thing. It's just a growing pain, in my opinion. They were at the point to where if it wasn't your role, you were actually a little bit encouraged to not pitch in and do it, if that makes sense, because everybody needed their swim lanes. I wouldn't say that this is a pro or con or a bad thing. It wasn't a good thing for what I expected and what I was planning on my job or my role being. This is me being very conscientious of the fact that I respect the fact that the company needed to go through it, so I'm not saying that it's a bad thing. It just wasn't what I expected, and I think it inhibited my ability to go and execute or develop a go-to-market the way that I thought that I was going to be able to, right? If I would have maybe gone in a year earlier and it was still this all hands on deck, any good idea is a great idea, that kind of thing. Doesn't matter who you are. You could be sales ops and you could talk about sales strategy or something needed in product features. I thought that was the startup that I was joining. But it had hit this inflection point with size and revenue and all that they needed much more definition of roles, and they were still building that when I came on board.
I've heard this phrase, happiness is measured by expectations.
Right. That's really good.
I can definitely see if just like go-to-market can mean a lot of different things to a lot of, different people and can encompass a lot of different things. Startup can go from 3 people in somebody's kitchen, working out of a garage to multi-million-dollar, revenue generating, hundreds of people pre-IPO. It sounds like what you're saying is understanding the stage of growth that a company is in and making sure that your expectations of your role and the amount of input that you'll have matches what the company's expecting in the culture that they're trying to build. And am I echoing that back correctly?
Absolutely.
Okay.
Back to my engineer mindset, exactly what you just said. How do we give people advice on how to fix that? besides just the mess around and find out mentality or, strategy that I took. And I do not recommend that at all to anyone. Mess around and find out is what I did. And I don't have any regrets on doing it because, it's what I wanted to do. I do think that I could have had different expectations potentially, or maybe chose a different startup, to go work with.
Certainly. Yeah. I think that's definitely a lesson learned, right? And sometimes that's a lesson that you can't actually learn before you learn it. You have to, sometimes you have to experience it. Hopefully that's not the case for everybody, or else the entire thesis of this podcast is null and void, trying to teach people the lessons so that, they don't make the mistakes or they learn them earlier and faster. That probably is the same for joining any company. If it's a large company means different things to different people, right? I've worked for large companies, but I've never worked for, a company like GE in the 80s, where it's we make light bulbs and jet engines and nuclear power plants, right? And those are completely different, probably billion-dollar business units, or, the equivalent of today.
And that maybe goes a little bit back to why I respect the fact that the startup had to start figuring out roles. You don't want a light bulb engineer working on that jet engine. Those are probably distinctions that are important. I look back on it, the way that you classified it, it's a lesson learned. But I did not think that the size of the startup would be a lesson that they were going through at that point in time. But now I know, and hopefully by sharing, everybody that's listening knows.
I can't imagine that it's very easy to go through an interview process and discover that. I mean, when you ask a person that during the interview process, you're going to get their viewpoint on that. And that might not reflect the reality on the ground when you get into the role. They might answer you honestly in a way that is exactly what you want to hear. And by the time you get into the role, 4 weeks later, it's not true anymore. That's just how the world works, unfortunately.
Yeah. From that standpoint, John, as far as advice, I would probably say I didn't take my own advice that I've given to so many people. I wanted it, and so I didn't ask as many questions as I probably should have. Looking back on it, I'm going to blame myself more than I'm going to blame them or who, hired me or anything like that. I'm the one who made the decision to leave the big company and go to the startup. So where I'm going with this is the fact that if I would have maybe asked some more insightful questions, like what you just asked, what is go-to-market to you? And they responded with something that was just out of left field, maybe I would have been able to understand a little bit better that maybe we're not aligned on what the expectations are going to be. But to be fair, I don't think my role ended up the way that my manager expected it to either. And that's just the turn on the dime of a startup.
I can absolutely understand that. I've definitely felt like in past roles that I have is the experience with the company that I'm coming from, because there's going to be such a tight relationship, that's going to be a massive advantage for me. Having the contacts that I have from the previous employer and, how it operates and going to the new employer. Is that something that you felt played out very, very differently from how you expected it to, or not?
Yeah, absolutely. Because the way that it ended up turning out is it goes back to crafting the strategy or executing somebody else's, right? With my strategy, the relationships that I had were going to be extremely valuable because we were going to, educate each other and go together hand in hand. The way that my role kind of morphed into, it was more of a business development on the back end, like engineering and product development and product management kind of thing. And I think I was effective. I probably wasn't as effective as I would have been if I was more passionate about it, doing something that I excelled in. So I wasn't executing something that I was excited about. My relationships weren't valuable for two reasons. It wasn't my strategy, and the relationships I had weren't valuable in the strategy that I was given by others.
That's disappointing. You're hoping for one thing, and then sometimes the reality on the ground doesn't match. and then you flex to it.
Right.
And then if, over time you decide, oh, I'm unhappy or not having the impact I want, then maybe you leave. That's understandable too. One of the things that I'm thinking about is like, that sounds like an ISV relationship. So that's the, independent software vendor, or an OEM relationship, like a separate, like original equipment manufacturer relationship, or even like an alliance partnership. In my career, I don't know that I've necessarily worked very, very closely with those teams to the point where I would be able to leave the company that I'm at and then go somewhere else and say, hey, I have all these deep relationships with those people, to be able to build those relationships and integrate into, their planning. What was it at your previous employer where you built that up? Or how did you build that up, I guess?
I think, it goes back to my expectations kind of being wrong, John. Like, definitions of ISV and OEM and all of that, right? I mean, that's one of the things that I actually learned is, there's ISVs that are technology that, is marketed and sold together hand in hand. And then there's ISVs that are on the back end that nobody even knows that there's an ISV relationship, right? Maybe take a product that you or I consume that runs on Amazon. Well, Amazon doesn't go and sell that SaaS service along with that company. Some they do, though. Maybe if it's Marketplace or something like that. So I guess I illustrate that to show that all these relationships are significantly different. What I expected it to be is an ISV relationship where it's a better together kind of thing. And the reason that we wanted it, or we expected it to be like that, is our company, we were still selling our product, but we were also selling a version of it that was in, the previous company's product. It got really confusing because A didn't equal B. And I think that we thought originally that we were going to have this ISV relationship where we were going to market and going to talk to customers together because A and B were going to look a lot alike, and B from the big company was going to be the same apple as the one from company A. The only thing that was going to be different was, well, do you want to purchase it as part of your relationship with big company, or do you want to go to company A? Well, that unraveled tremendously as it went on. So I think the question that you asked, and I went down a little bit of a different tangent, was around, relationships with those ISVs and things like that. Because of the fact that I see that there's different types of ISV relationships and things like that, I thought we'd be hand in hand going to market together. So I thought that my relationships on the sales side were going to be very valuable, but it turned out that it was much more of an ISV relationship where, yeah, you're in our product. We don't need you except for just deliver the technology. And that's the type of ISV relationship that it became. So my relationships weren't valuable. So I think that answers your question as I circle around and try to land the plane.
That makes absolute sense. So I definitely have been in a situation like that. I think when I was at Google Cloud, we had like one of our data engineering products was actually an OEM version of a third party's product. And so that third party was like, oh, we actually want to like also sell an enhanced version of this product, like, on your marketplace. And, how do we like get that going? And I think it was interesting to see that, relationship evolve. Is the interest of the company really like, oh, we just want to sell this OEM version and, not actually have to worry about selling at all. Like all we have to do is be more and more valuable to Google Cloud. So, Google Cloud just keeps on selling it.
Right.
As opposed to, oh, how do we go out and sell this with the Google Cloud sellers? I don't know if that's like a direct parallel, but maybe something along those lines.
Very close. it gets real complicated and sticky in alliances when you're talking about OEM or ISV or, how all that happens. And I respect the people that have been in alliances their entire career because, it can be a spaghetti of things that you're having to deal with because of both things that you and I just talked about.
It's fascinating because it's yet another job and category of job that most people don't know that there's like an entire career within, right? Managing the relationships between two medium or large size companies who sell complementary products or co-sell together, or one company selling a product that uses the other company's product, underneath. So it's like understanding the alliances between those two companies and, having an entire category of job who's just here to like explain this relationship to the other, within the company and like to the other company as well. And definitely a type of job that I didn't know existed before I got to work in a big company.
And it just speaks to the fact that most people have no clue how complex how things will be sold, where you can buy it, how it will be marketed, what teams will be involved, and then how any integrated solutions and the vendors on the back end get paid. That's extremely complex with all kinds of legalities that we won't go into on this show. But one thing that I think is really complex in your journey here, Brad, is the decision point to go from manager to individual contributor. I think we have to pick that apart and just talk about what made you want to go back to being an individual contributor after saying so many smart manager things as a manager.
It's an interesting one, Nick. I mean, I still miss leading a team, but the way that I saw it was just not having direct reports was gonna be kind of a pause, because this thing was obviously going to be amazingly successful, and I was going to build a team around me and all that, right? So that's kind of how I saw it at that point in time. And you can always be a leader without being a manager, and that's the thing that I've always, enjoyed more than the manager side of things. Not that I don't love, managing and having direct reports and impacting people and that kind of thing, but I definitely got the opportunity to influence folks successfully or unsuccessfully, even though I didn't have direct reports. So yeah, to me, the decision was more of I'm going to get to build something, and I'll build relationships, sales strategy, and at some point in time, I'll build a team. So it was just a pause on managing people. That's what I thought was going to happen. Best laid plans, right?
We're trying to help listeners understand that if you decide to pursue people leadership, that it doesn't mean you have to be locked into that forever. So when you interviewed with the startup, they knew it was an individual contributor role. You knew it was an individual contributor role. Was there any kind of questioning from them to you? Hey, Brad, why don't you want to be a manager anymore? Or why don't you want to lead people anymore? Does that come up even?
I don't think it came up in this scenario, Nick, because we were all focused on the future of what it was going to be.
Okay.
That kind of thing. And I have a lot of respect for the manager that I had at the company, and I think that he also saw it as having somebody on his team or on his bench to where he would have somebody with that skill set if something changed. As things started to not be as successful as we expected them to be, there were conversations around what leadership role of managing a team of SEs that I would take on. And it really didn't go anywhere at the same time that I was considering, moving on. I think that I might have gone back into management there if I decided that I would have stayed.
Okay. Is it hard to get used to being an individual contributor again after having been a people manager? I've never been through this transition specifically, so I keep asking people because I'm really curious. Once you've been the boss, and all of a sudden you're not the boss, are there certain things that you have to put in check and remind yourself, hey, I'm not the guy or the gal?
That's a really interesting question that I have dealt with significantly, but it's probably at a point later in my career that we can talk about as we keep going through the journey, because the transition at this point of going from manager to individual contributor and at a new company, it was really easy in my opinion, because I was even supposed to take this partnership and take it and educate the account SEs at the company on what this thing was and what it wasn't. So using the manager skills where nobody's going to tell you what you need to do, just go and do it and start reaching out and doing things and talking to people, that kind of thing. Those are actually assets that, I was able to leverage. That part of it wasn't hard to transition. It was definitely strange to not have one-on-ones and, have career progression conversations and things like that. To this day, I do still miss being able to help someone, move along in their career or something like that, for however big or little, I actually contributed. The thing that I did not miss and was not hard at all, though, was and I'm just going to go ahead and say it, the adult babysitting side of being a manager. Because depending on, the company that you're at and the team that you have, I was very lucky before I left. My team was fantastic because I had the opportunity to build the team that I led for as long before I left and went to the startup. So I didn't have a lot of that adult babysitting, but anybody that's thinking about a career in management, get ready for it, because there is definitely going to be a lot. So I didn't miss any of that in the teams that I saw around me.
I don't know if this ever occurred to you, but I want to bounce this idea off of you, is that once I've been a manager and sat through performance review cycles, and interviewing, I'm like, oh, I'm going to be really a lot better at interviewing now. If somebody's interviewing me for something, I'm going to be a great interview because I've gone through it on the other side. So I know, what the questions actually mean. And then when I write like a self-evaluation and like help craft my own performance review, I'm going to be really, really good at that because I know exactly what that person is going through. And, that empathy is going to help me like help them make my review really easy. Oh yeah, you have done all those things. Yes, those do align with our corporate values in this specific way. And yes, you do have evidence of all this stuff that you've gone through. I don't know, that's my experience. Did that track at all with you?
It does track on a lot of things significantly. I agree. Like, I do find that those experiences of interviewing and going through performance reviews and things like that have helped me be very direct and I guess kind of drive the conversations with my manager now to go, where I want them to. Whether you're selling to a customer or you're selling to your manager that you should get a raise or a promotion, you're always selling, right? So I do think that it's helped me there. The thing that I was smiling about, John, is the fact that I kind of had the same idea. Interviewing people would help me to interview for other jobs. And it did in a lot of areas, but interviewing for a second line manager humbled me significantly. It's a great example of what got you here won't get you there, because the thought process and the things that I was asked and, how well prepared I was, it was not in line with, I think, what the expectations were.
I mean, I'm fascinated by this. So I would love to get any insight that you might have on that.
What I would say that I think is pretty universal, and I won't get specifically into my experience because it was a very unique situation that called for the right person for the job, and the right person did get the job. Like, I was very humbled working for her when she got the job, and I told her that directly, 3 months after reporting to her, because I was interviewing for a second line manager and I didn't get the promotion, but one of my peers did. And it was a peer that I hadn't worked with. But go back to the universal things that I learned in that process is when you're at that level, sometimes you get the opportunity to kind of try to understand what the organization needs. Sometimes you don't. And you kind of have to figure out what your strategy would be and deliver it very confidently, and you might be completely wrong because you just don't know what the organization's going through. I went very focused on sales strategy and, how I would run the team, expectations of my team and stuff like that. And the person that got the job was much more focused on how to bring the team together, personal development, and some of the other areas. And it was very important as the organization changed and transitioned and transformed that she brought everybody together in a very, very good way. I'm not saying that I don't think I could have, but she knew that that was priority one, where to me it was like 2 or 3. I don't think I'm doing a great job of clarifying it, but my point is that when you're at that level, at a second line, it's much more, this is my overall high-level strategy and how I'm going to lead my frontline managers to help me, deliver that. Whereas a frontline manager, all that's important, but the tactical stuff is really important also. You know what I mean? In a sales manager role, running forecasts, making sure that people are delivering what they need to do, pipeline generation, activity, things like that, where you kind of have to set the strategy at a second line and hope that your leaders under you are adopting and bought in and part of it as much as you want them to be, that kind of thing.
One of the things that I came to realization of was maybe a little bit over a year into my role as a first line manager, my second line manager left, and there were people on the team who were like, well, you're going to apply for that director role. And I was like, I mean, you got to be kidding, right? I feel like I'm barely got my arms around, the job that I have. And you're talking about me like going up, like that sounds like a recipe for disaster. But that being said, I think that reach and interviewing for that next level might be the stepping stone to getting it eventually, right? Applying, interviewing, understanding like the relationships that you need to have at that, second line level. Like you said, like going in with an idea of a plan and then having it like, picked apart and people like critiquing it and saying like, well, have you thought about this? Or, you're talking about A, B, and C, but what about X, Y, and Z? Like, what are your thoughts on that? And then all of a sudden you understand that, you've been focusing on the wrong thing. And that maybe you don't even understand what the job is another realization, right? So like, I'm a sales engineering manager right now. What does a sales engineering director do? What is that job? Like if I don't know what that job is, then maybe I shouldn't, be applying for it, like.
Yeah. And that's the interesting thing, right? I mean, this one, that job, not the position, the job and the needs for that job at that point in time, that role, if you will, were different than what the role probably was on the other side of the U.S. for that director role. So, and to your point, that's why it's always good to be interviewing. It's a skill that you need to continue to hone, just like your technical chops. I learned so much during that process that will help me, the next time that I interview for a second line manager role, if that's in my future.
Yeah. Very insightful. Thanks a lot, Brad.
Sure.
Let's continue the journey if we can, Brad. So you eventually leave startup life or left at least one startup, right?
I left that startup, went to another one, really because I was just burnt out and reorganization didn't work out the way that I wanted it to. And so I went to another startup, which it was the thing that nobody should ever do. I was running away from something as opposed to running to something. So it didn't last very long. Much smaller startup. It reminds you that employment at will is a thing. Unfortunately, I got laid off there for all kinds of different reasons I won't get into. That would be over an adult beverage, and I'll be even more long-winded than I will be on the podcast here. But yeah, I left, or I was asked to leave as part of a layoff. It was a definite low moment, we'll put it that way.
can't possibly talk about being a builder without referencing episode 148, The Magic of Building, with Chris Wall, because Chris is also a builder, and he too went and joined a startup. That's a great episode to go back and listen to after you've listened to this episode with Brad. When a builder doesn't get to build, they're just not happy. There's a creative element to building something, whatever it is. Maybe it's a strategy like Brad talked about, a data center, or a team of people. Some people really relish the creative control of the building process. Other people would prefer not to be the builder. They just want some guidelines to go and execute. This reminded me of a really good discussion we had with Tim Crawford in episode 244 about the decision point between being an individual contributor and a people manager. He talked about how it was a decision between building people or technology. And as you saw in Brad's case, he was still building something as an individual contributor at the startup, or at least trying to, but it was more centered on technology than building and developing other people like a people manager would. But I will say, this is an illustration of another kind of job out there that we haven't really highlighted on the show. This idea of technical alliance. Every technology company is going to have teams of people that work on alliance partnerships, whether that's for integration, things like OEM, original equipment manufacturer, where one company might put their software or hardware inside another company's solution and you might not even know it. It could be called several different things in a job opening or job description, but a lot of times those fall under the category of technical alliances in some way, shape, or form. And if you are thinking of joining a startup, I think based on our discussion today, it makes a lot of sense during the interview process to ask how clearly defined the roles and responsibilities are at the company. So you can ask that of the recruiter, the hiring manager. You can ask that in a technical interview if you're going to be interviewing with other people that you would potentially be teammates with. So you could ask each person in the interview process about that in regard to the organization as a whole, and then how well defined their roles and responsibilities are. And I think that would give you a pretty good picture of just how collaborative of an environment you might be walking into, or just how structured of an organization you might be walking into. You heard toward the end of that discussion that Brad eventually had to go through a layoff event after he left the first startup. We'll talk more about that next week.
Farewell, listeners. Tune in next time as the journey continues. I'm John White at BJourneyman, for Nick Cordy at NetworkNerd_, signing off.
Adios.